When discussing Malcolm X's essay, Coming to an Awareness of Language, it is very important, I believe, to discuss where Malcolm X was in his life and to give a little bit of context to understand how he got into prison and what that transformation was like for him while he was in prison. So obviously the essay, actually it's a segment of his autobiography, focuses on his time in prison, but it was written years after the fact. So he does have a little bit of perspective and he does have a little bit of reflection, and it is written after he has become this enormous figure within the black separatist movement. Okay, but really his story starts back in the state of Nebraska with an attack on his family by the Ku Klux Klan. So Malcolm X's father, I believe his name was Earl Little, was a supporter of Marcus Garvey. So Marcus Garvey was the head of the Back to Africa movement, as it was known, which basically stated that African Americans would not achieve any level of equality or significant level of privilege within the United States, and that the only way to remedy this was to create an all black nation and to have African Americans have a mass migration, an exodus really, back to the continent of Africa. And this would result in a society in which every member of society, from the king or the president or the prime minister down to the person who shines your shoes, will be black. And that would result in a true meritocracy, meaning if you are skilled enough, if you are intelligent enough, if you are hardworking enough, you can be successful within the society. And there would not be a division based on race. Okay. Now, this is what Marcus Garvey believed in, is what he taught, and Malcolm X's father was a great believer in it. Now, this resulted in him being a target by the Ku Klux Klan. So Malcolm X's father was attacked first in the state of Nebraska, and he moved his family to Michigan, and a few years later was attacked again, where his home was burned down. And 2 years after that, he was beaten, severely beaten to death. And the consensus is that it was likely the Ku Klux Klan that was responsible for his death. Okay. Now, this happened in the year 1929. Malcolm X was a young child, and this really formed Malcolm X's understanding of the world that he lived in and the society that he lived in. So he witnessed firsthand some very brutal attacks on his own family, and those attacks were based on part on his family's ideology and on part on his family's race, and he understood that at a very young age. Okay, but as happens often when young people are exposed to this type of violence, Malcolm X himself turned to a life of crime, and he became basically a street criminal, traveling from Harlem to Boston to Detroit. He later made a home in Boston, but he was involved in gambling, illegal underground illicit gambling, robberies, drug dealing, and even procuring prostitution, which is to say he was a pimp. Okay. Now, all of this came to an end in 1946 when he was sentenced to serve time in prison for a robbery that he was convicted of. Okay, and really, it's the time that he's in prison where he undergoes this huge transformation. As we read about in the essay, this is where he basically teaches himself to read and write, primarily for the purpose of making his voice known to people in power and for interacting with Elijah Muhammad. Now, Elijah Muhammad was the leader of the Nation of Islam. And in understanding Malcolm X's story, it's very important to understand what the Nation of Islam is. Okay, so the title Nation of Islam, for some people, can be a bit deceiving. Now, traditional Sunni and Shiite Muslims will claim that the Nation of Islam is not true Islam. Okay, but what it is it is a movement that celebrates and promotes Black power and Black empowerment. Okay, and they take a lot of the terminology from the Quran and from traditional Islam, and they use it to express ideals that involve black empowerment, okay, including such ideas that Africans, black Africans, are the direct descendants of God. Okay, it's very controversial stuff. And it's also important to understand the sort of split between the Nation of Islam and the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, Dr. Martin Luther King, his civil rights movement is based on nonviolent direct action. Okay, a lot of people say he's all about nonviolence, and that's true. But he also said that nonviolence by itself will get you nothing. Right? If you're just sitting back being peaceful, what will you achieve? But nonviolent direct action means that you are confronting the systems of power and the institutions that keep some people oppressed and other people privileged. Okay, but Dr. Martin Luther King's philosophy is based on Christianity. And for a large segment of the black population at the time, now this is starting in the 1940s, but really going through the 60s as well, for a large segment of the black population at that time, Christianity was seen as an instrument or a tool of oppression. Okay. Now, certainly there are many very important and prominent figures in the civil rights movement who saw Christianity as a tool for liberation. Dr. King being probably the most famous one, but there were hundreds and hundreds of them. But you have to realize that there were members of the black empowerment movement who were disillusioned with Christianity because they're asking themselves, isn't Christianity used to justify some of the oppression that is occurring against black people? Wasn't Christianity used to justify the slave trade, for example? And so they really wanted to turn away from Christianity, and they found that Islam and a lot of the rhetoric of Islam originated in North Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Africa, and that there was some type of alternative to the Christian narrative. So really, this is a huge split between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and their followers. Okay. Now, going back to Malcolm X in prison, he really is learning about this stuff as he's in prison. He's teaching himself to read. He's interacting with Elijah Muhammad, who is the head of the Nation of Islam, and he's really sort of steeping himself in this ideology that rejects Christianity, for one, but it also rejects the ideas of integration and the idea that African Americans and other underprivileged peoples should seek equality and opportunity within the United States. Okay, he rejects that idea. He says, why would I want to be part of a system and part of a society that has rejected me? Okay, hence black separatism or black nationalism, which is the ideology that blacks should have their own society. Okay, so when Malcolm X, I mean, this is a huge transformation for him. He's gone from a criminal, steeped in anger, really living with the memory of this violence that he has witnessed, to somebody with a very strong ideology that basically says, I do not want to be part of your society. If the U.S. society is meant to benefit whites primarily, as you saw it, which is an oversimplification, but on some level you can say that whites are the beneficiaries of U.S. society, especially as it existed in the 40s through the 60s, that he would create his own society. Okay. So Malcolm X goes on to become a minister within the Nation of Islam. He had a ministry in Harlem. And as we're going to see elsewhere in this class, Harlem really was a center for African American thought and empowerment. And it really attracted some of the greatest thinkers, some of the greatest artists within the African American movement. So here's Malcolm X in Harlem basically preaching separatism and black nationalism. And really forms a really interesting sort of conflict between two movements within the Black empowerment movement who have similar goals, which is the end of oppression, but have very, very different ideologies. Okay. However, Malcolm X, in part because he started to outshine Elijah Muhammad, he starts to have conflicts within the Nation of Islam. Okay. So he's considered too powerful. His following becomes larger than the following of Elijah Muhammad. Okay. Elijah Muhammad is considered a prophet. Malcolm X is a regular man. Okay. So if he is outshining Elijah Muhammad, that's going to be a very serious problem. Also, Malcolm X comes to find out that Elijah Muhammad is hypocritical in his belief toward women. In other words, he preaches celibacy and marriage and one marriage between a man and woman, but he's having all of these extramarital affairs. So Malcolm X becomes very disillusioned with the Nation of Islam, and he starts to branch off. Okay, so then Malcolm X actually in the 60s goes through a second transformation. And this is where he turns to the Sunni branch of Islam. He makes a pilgrimage to Mecca. He meets with all of these world leaders who represent Islam and other world leaders, including Fidel Castro and some of the other leaders that were basically, at least in their eyes, standing up to American imperialism. Okay, now this is where Malcolm X's story really takes a big turn, because now he has rejected the Nation of Islam, which was teaching black power and blacks as the direct descendants of God. And he has turned to a branch of Islam that does preach power to oppressed peoples. It does preach compassion. It does preach self-defense, unlike Martin Luther King's nonviolent direct action. But it doesn't have a racial component, right? Notice that Sunni Islam is not based on race. It's based on a certain path that is meant to be a spiritual path and to follow God. But people of any race can really follow this path. And Malcolm X, as I said, has this second transformation, and now he is starting to preach empowerment for all oppressed people. Okay, now he has a problem with the Nation of Islam, because he is contradicting their teachings. And he also has issues with the FBI and the CIA because he's becoming way too powerful for their liking. And a situation like that can't last long. So in 1965, he is assassinated. The consensus is that he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam, 3 of whom went to prison for his assassination. But there are all of these ideas, and with differing degrees of certainty, that the FBI and that the CIA were involved and basically infiltrated the Nation of Islam in order to push for his assassination. This really is, if you think about the article, the essay, Coming to an Awareness of Language, this is the context, right? Malcolm X is writing about his time in prison and the process of learning to read, which really, none of this would have been possible. The ministry, the explorations of different ideologies, the mass following that he has, and presenting an alternative to Dr. King. Not that I disagree with Dr. King, but for many people it was very important to have an ideology that was not based in Christianity, as I said. That's really, really essential to understanding when he says, I opened up the dictionary and I started with aardvark. Look how far that actually took him. So I think that's a testament to the power of literacy, of reading and writing, and how it can affect our ideologies and different movements toward power.